Welcome to lesson 1.1, What is Science? So there are lots of questions that you might have about the world around you. Where did plants come from? Animals come from? How did I come to be? And we've tried to answer those questions in different ways. Some ways of explaining the world have stayed the same over time. Science is always changing. So what are the goals of this? One goal of science is to provide natural explanations for events in the natural world. Science always also aims to use those explanations to understand patterns in nature and to make useful predictions about natural events. So it's not just a collection of never-changing facts or unchanging beliefs. Some scientific facts will change soon if they haven't already, and scientific ideas are open to testing, discussion, and revision. Science is an organized way of gathering and analyzing evidence about the natural world. For example, researchers can use science to answer questions about how whales communicate, how far they travel, and how they are affected by environmental changes. Science deals only with the natural world. Scientists collect and organize information in an orderly way, looking for patterns and connections among events. Scientists propose explanations that are based on evidence, not belief. Then they test those explanations with more evidence. The physical universe is a system composed of parts and processes that interact. All objects in the universe and all interactions among those objects are governed by universal natural laws. One goal of science is to provide natural explanations for events in the natural world. Science also aims to use those explanations to understand patterns in nature and to make useful predictions about natural events. Despite all of our scientific knowledge, much of nature remains a mystery. Almost every major scientific discovery raises more questions than it answers. This constant change shows that science continues to advance. Learning about science means understanding what we know and what we don't know. Science rarely proves anything in absolute terms. Scientists aim for the best understanding of the natural world that current methods can reveal. Science has allowed us to build enough understanding to make useful predictions about the natural world. So what procedures are at the core of scientific methodology? Scientific methodology involves observing and asking questions, making inferences and forming hypotheses, conducting controlled experiments, collecting and analyzing data, and drawing conclusions. Scientific investigations begin with an observation, the act of noticing and describing events or processes in a careful, orderly way. For example, researchers observe that marsh grass grows taller in some places than others. This observation led to a question: why do marsh grasses grow to different heights in different places? After posing questions, scientists use further observations to make inferences, or logical interpretations based on what is already known. Inference can lead to a hypothesis, or a scientific explanation for a set of observations that can be tested in ways that support or reject it. For example, researchers inferred that something limits grass growth in some places. Based on their knowledge of salt marshes, they hypothesized that marsh grass growth is limited by available nitrogen. Testing a scientific hypothesis often involves designing an experiment that keeps track of various factors that can change, or variables. Examples of variables include temperature, light, time, availability of nutrients. Whenever possible, a hypothesis should be tested by an experiment in which only one variable is changed. That's important. All other variables should be kept unchanged or controlled. This type of experiment is called a controlled experiment. It is important to control variables because if several variables are changed in the experiment, researchers can't easily tell which variable is responsible for any results they observe. The variable that is deliberately changed is called the independent variable, also called the manipulated variable. Independent, also known as manipulated, deliberately changed. The variable that is observed and that changes in response to the independent variable is called the dependent variable, also known as the responding variable. So dependent, observed, and changes in response to the independent variable. Typically, an experiment is divided into control and experimental groups. The control group is exposed to the same conditions as the experimental group, except for one independent variable. It doesn't get the independent variable at all. The control group does not. Scientists set up several sets of control and experimental groups to try to reproduce or replicate their observations. For example, the researchers selected similar plots of marsh grass. All plots had similar plant density, soil type, input of fresh water, and height above average tide level. The plots were divided into control and experimental groups. The researchers added nitrogen fertilizer, which was the independent variable, to the experimental plots. Then they observed the growth of marsh grass, which was the dependent variable, in both experimental and control plots. Scientists record experimental observations, gathering information called data. There are two main types of data, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data are numbers obtained by counting or measuring. In the marsh grass experiment, it could indicate the number of plants per plot, plant sizes, and growth rates. Think of quantity, and so we're looking for numbers, okay? Something where there's counting or there's measuring, quantitative. Qualitative data are descriptive and involve characteristics that cannot usually be counted. In the marsh grass experiment, it might include notes about foreign objects in the plots or whether the grass was going upright or sideways. Qualitative, we're looking at the quality. Maybe we're looking at descriptive and the characteristics, things that can be written down that are not numbers. Maybe the color of something, as an example. Scientists choose appropriate tools for collecting and analyzing data. Tools include simple devices such as meter sticks, or sophisticated equipment such as machines or iPads that measure nitrogen content, and charts and graphs that help scientists organize their data. This graph shows how grass height changed over time, and we will learn how to graph. We always think of dry mix as a quick introduction. So your dependent or responding variable will go on the y-axis. Your manipulated or independent variable will go on the x-axis. In the past, data were recorded by hand. Today, researchers typically enter data into computers or iPads, which make organizing and analyzing data much easier. Researchers must be careful to avoid errors in data collection and analysis. Tools used to measure the size and weight of marsh grasses, for example, have limited accuracy. Data analysis and sample size must be chosen carefully. The larger the sample size, the more reliably researchers can analyze variation and evaluate differences between experimental and control groups. This is often a huge, when you're reading articles, you look for the sample size. If it's too small, it's not reliable. Scientists use experimental data as evidence to support or refute or revise the hypothesis that's being tested and to draw a valid conclusion. Analysis showed that marsh grasses grew taller than controls by adding nitrogen, so it grew taller. Drawing conclusions, new data may indicate that the researchers have the right general idea but are wrong about a few particulars. In that case, the original hypothesis is reevaluated and revised. New predictions are made and new experiments are designed. Hypotheses may have to be revised and experiments redone several times before a final hypothesis is supported and conclusions can be drawn. So you come down, nope, got to redo it again, and maybe you'll have to just keep doing it over and over again until you finally get something that you need. It is not always possible to test a hypothesis with an experiment. In some of these cases, researchers devise hypotheses that can be tested by observations. Animal behavior researchers, for example, might want to learn how animal groups interact in the wild by making field observations that disturb the animals as little as possible. Researchers analyze data from these observations and devise hypotheses that can be tested in different ways. Sometimes ethics prevent certain types of experiments, especially on us humans. For example, medical researchers who suspect that a chemical causes cancer, For example, would search for volunteers who have already been exposed to the chemical and compare them to people who have not been exposed to the chemical. They don't want to give a chemical that they think causes cancer. They wouldn't want to give it to humans and give them cancer. That wouldn't be right. The researchers still try to control as many variables as possible and might exclude volunteers who have serious health problems or known genetic conditions. Medical researchers always try to study large groups of subjects so that individual genetic differences do not produce misleading results. And hopefully that gives you a good idea of what science is. All right, have a great day. Jesus loves you.